Girl missing 6 years. Found after a dog at the $500 haunted cabin. Opened a sealed room. They said the girl vanished 6 years ago. Cold case. But Ranger, a retired canine, didn't care about the police reports. He cared about the scent coming from the basement wall of the town's most respected sheriff. He froze. He didn't bark. He whined, the specific sound for live victim. Evan Ward smashed the drywall with a sledgehammer, not knowing what he'd find. He didn't find insulation. He found a pair of terrified eyes staring back. And she was holding a finger to her lips. The snow was coming in sideways by the time Evan Ward eased his truck down the last mile of Highway 46. The storm chewed at the windshield like it wanted in, and the wipers fought for their lives with every pass. Silver Hollow, Colorado, barely existed on most maps, and this morning it looked like the storm was trying to erase it entirely. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, a grey-coated German shepherd with a scar through one ear and the posture of a soldier who never clocked out. His breath fogged the glass. His eyes never left the road ahead. Evan reached down and touched the dog's chest, a silent check. Ranger didn't lean in. He braced, muscles tight. That alone told Evan more than any weather alert. They rolled into town as the courthouse annex came into view, half buried in snowdrifts. No cars on the street, no people. Just the old brick building, lights flickering under the weight of the storm. Inside, the room was cramped and overheated, filled with locals who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Farmers, ranch hands, old men with faces carved from wind. And in the back, a deputy leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching everything with narrowed eyes. The moment Evan stepped inside, the hum of low conversation died. Ranger walked at his heel, silent, alert, scanning the room the way he used to scan alleyways overseas. Someone near the heater whispered something Evan couldn't hear. A younger man stared at Ranger like he'd seen a ghost he didn't want returning. The auctioneer rattled through trucks, tools, unpaid storage units. Evan barely listened. None of this was why he was here. Then it came. Parcel number 19B. Locals call it the Avery Ridge Cabin. Condition poor. 15 years of unpaid taxes. Opening bid $500. The room went still. Not bored still. Fear still. Eyes dropped to boots. A woman crossed herself. The deputy in the back straightened. Evan lifted his hand. 500 from the gentleman in the coat. Any 600? Any at all? Nothing. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Ranger shifted closer to Evan's leg, his breathing sharp, nostrils flaring like he caught something no human nose ever could. Sold. The gavel cracked through the room like a warning shot, and then every head turned toward Evan. Not curious, not judging, warning him without words, the way mountain towns do when they've already dug enough graves. The clerk shoved the paperwork at him with hands that trembled. Good luck, she muttered, or something that sounded like it. Back outside, the wind tore at his coat. Ranger stayed tight to his hip, tail stiff. At the hardware store, while grabbing batteries and lantern oil, the old man behind the counter leaned forward and lowered his voice. You bought the Avery place. Evan nodded. Should have gone to the sheriff instead. That land doesn't like company. Hasn't for a long time. Evan kept packing the supplies. I'm not looking for company. The old man didn't smile. Folks say the cabin went quiet the same week the Clay girl vanished. Emma Clay, 8 years old, never found. That caught Evan's pulse off guard. He'd heard dozens of missing child cases in his career, but the name felt heavy, like it belonged to more than a report. When Evan didn't respond, the old man added, almost like the cabin swallowed the truth and closed its mouth. By the time Evan reached Avery Ridge, dusk had smeared itself across the treetops. The cabin appeared through the snowfall like something half remembered from a bad dream. Roof sagging, porch tilting, Windows blacked out. Ranger didn't jump out of the truck immediately. He stayed planted, ears pinned, staring at the cabin with the kind of rigid, instinctive focus only battle dogs had. Evan opened the door wider. "Come on, partner." Ranger hopped down but landed stiff, not curious, not relaxed. His feet hit the snow without a sound, and he scanned the clearing as if expecting movement behind every drift. Inside, the cold wrapped around Evan like wet cloth. Furniture frozen in place. Dust thick enough to hold footprints. A jacket hung from a wooden peg, untouched. Time had stopped here, but not peacefully. Then Ranger froze. It was instant. His body locked, hackles up, eyes glued to the Riverstone fireplace. Evan followed his stare. Nothing unusual. Old stone. Cold hearth. But Ranger's reaction wasn't mild. It was the same silent alarm he'd once given Evan seconds before finding a hidden grenade under a collapsed wall in Fallujah. "Easy," Evan whispered. But his voice didn't steady the room. It just made the silence feel deeper. Ranger stepped forward, slow and deliberate. He lowered his head to the base of the fireplace and drew in a long breath. Then another. Then he stiffened. He scraped one paw against the stone. Not frantic. One sharp drag. A signal. Evan crouched beside him. The stone was cold. Solid. But Ranger didn't blink. "You're telling me something, aren't you?" Evan murmured. Then Ranger did something he hadn't done in almost a year. He let out a low, rumbling growl. Not loud. Not meant to scare. Meant to warn. Something was under there. Before Evan could inspect further, a sharp knock exploded against the front door. Ranger spun, positioning himself between Evan and the entrance, teeth bared. Evan rose slowly. The door creaked open, snow blowing in around a tall figure. Sheriff Mason. Hargreaves stepped inside like he owned the place, brushing snow from his shoulders, eyes scanning everything with too much interest. He looked from Evan to Ranger to the fireplace. "You the one who bought this place?" he asked. Evan nodded. Mason's eyes narrowed. Only slightly, but enough for Evan to catch it. "Well, congratulations," the sheriff said. "Most folks around here know better. Hope you sleep easy your first night." He stepped back outside, but just before the wind swallowed him, he added quietly, with a voice like gravel dragging across concrete, "Some doors in this valley were sealed for a reason." Ranger didn't move until the sheriff's truck disappeared down the trail. Only then did he return to the fireplace, placing his paw on the exact same stone as before. Evan stared at the dog, a slow chill crawling up his spine. This wasn't superstition, wasn't rumor, wasn't the weather. Something inside that cabin had been waiting 6 years to be found, and Ranger had just told him where to start. The storm thickened after nightfall. Snow hammered the tin roof like a second heartbeat, steady and hard. Evan tried to rest on the old cot against the far wall, but sleep wouldn't come. The cabin felt restless, as if its bones remembered something it didn't want to say aloud. Ranger paced. Not the bored, restless pacing of a dog stuck indoors. This was different. Purposeful. Tight circles around the fireplace. Snout low. Ears pinned. Every lap ended the same way, nose pressed to the seam where the hearth met the floor. Evan watched him from the cot, eyes narrowed. "What do you smell?" Ranger didn't look at him. He scraped once at a narrow gap between two stones. A low vibration traveled through his chest, a controlled growl Evan hadn't heard since their deployment years earlier. It was the sound Ranger used to give when his nose landed on something lethal. Evan stood and crossed the room. His boots thudded softly on the warped floorboards. He crouched beside the dog, shining his flashlight along the seam. There, half hidden under soot, was a rectangular stone that didn't quite match the others. Slightly smoother, edges too perfect. He ran his fingertips along the gap. The surface was cold enough to bite his skin. Ranger backed up, planting himself squarely behind Evan, watching the stone the way a man watches a ticking device. "All right, partner, I'm listening." Evan went to the truck and returned with a crowbar. His breath fogged the air as he wedged the tip beneath the strange stone. He applied pressure. Nothing budged. He changed angles, leaned in harder. A faint crack whispered from the mortar. Ranger's ears twitched. Evan pushed again. The stone shifted a fraction, then another. Finally it lifted with a dull scrape, heavy as a gravestone. Cold air rushed out of the opening, brushing his face like a breath that had been trapped too long. Under the hearth lay a hollow space carved into the earth, a makeshift chamber barely, large enough to hold anything at all. Evan lowered the flashlight inside. 2 objects rested at the bottom. A military-grade steel case, scratched, dented, sealed by rusted latches. And next to it, small and out of place in the dark, was a single child's shoe. Blue canvas, white rubber toe, laces missing, as though it had been set there, not dropped, as though someone had placed it with care. Evan felt the hairs on his neck rise. Ranger stepped forward and sat beside the opening. No growl, no bark, just a quiet, resolute stillness. His breathing slowed, his posture softened. Mission complete. That was the look. The same look Ranger gave after locating a buried survivor in Kandahar. The same eerie calm he carried when he knew his work had meaning beyond commands. Evan reached down and lifted the shoe. The canvas was dry, dust-free, preserved in the cold like it had been waiting. A child's name was written inside with faded marker. Emma. He swallowed hard. This belonged to her. 6 years missing. No body, no clues, no trace. And her shoe was under the fireplace of a cabin no one wanted to buy. The steel case was heavier than expected. The latches resisted at first, then popped with a metallic cough. Evan opened it slowly, half expecting the contents to explode into memory or horror. Inside lay notebooks wrapped in plastic, a small recorder, several folded maps, and a photograph of a man and a young girl smiling on a hiking trail. Nathan Clay and his daughter Emma. Evan remembered the case. Every cop in the state had seen their faces once. Then the story faded like all unsolved tragedies do. But standing here now, with Ranger pressed against his side and Emma's shoe turning cold in his hand, the weight of the truth settled on him, like the storm outside. Ranger leaned forward, touching his nose to the empty cavity, then looked up at Evan with a clarity that felt almost human. "You found it," Evan whispered. "You knew something was here." Ranger blinked once, slow and sure, as if confirming a truth Evan hadn't spoken yet. This wasn't an abandoned cabin. This was a sealed crime scene. And the person who sealed it had never expected a retired K-9 to open the first door. Evan packed the items back into the steel case, but kept the shoe in his hand, turning it over and over, his thoughts racing. Someone had hidden this cavity. Someone had wanted Emma's trail buried. Someone powerful enough to scare a whole town silent. A sudden sound cracked through the cabin. A single knock. Not wind, not wood settling. A knock, light, deliberate. Ranger shot up, body rigid, tail low, his gaze locked on the front door, eyes sharp enough to cut through darkness. Evan reached for his pistol, breath held. Another knock, this one softer, as if testing whether anyone inside was brave enough to answer. Evan stepped forward. Ranger blocked him with his body, planting himself in the doorway, shoulders squared. It wasn't fear. It was a warning. Not yet. Evan froze, pulse thudding in his ears. The third knock never came. Footsteps retreated in the snow. Slow, crunching, unhurried. Whoever was outside wanted him to know they weren't rushing. They weren't afraid. and they'd be back. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Ranger stayed at the door long after the footsteps faded, refusing to move. His tail didn't twitch, his ears didn't drop, his stance didn't break. Evan had seen him face explosives, ambushes, and collapsing buildings. But he had never seen Ranger this still, this focused, this certain. Whatever they had uncovered tonight was only the beginning, and Ranger had just awakened the first ghost. The wind outside had settled into a low moan, steady and distant, like the mountain was trying to warn them without raising its voice. Evan set the steel case on the old kitchen table, its legs groaning under the weight. Ranger stayed close, his shoulder brushing Evan's thigh every time Evan reached for something inside the box, as if anchoring him to the moment. Inside were notebooks wrapped in plastic sleeves, a recorder with dead batteries, a stack of folded maps, and one photograph. The picture stopped Evan cold. A man in his 30s, lean, sunburned, smiling in a way only fathers do when the world hasn't bruised them yet. Beside him, an 8-year-old girl with light hair in braids, sneakers too big for her feet, and a grin so bright it pulled the eye. Emma Clay, missing 6 years, presumed dead by everyone except the parents who prayed until they couldn't. Ranger sniffed the photo once gently, then looked up at Evan. Not confused, not curious, almost confirming, like he recognized something beneath the paper that Evan couldn't smell. Evan opened the first notebook. Clean handwriting filled the pages. A teacher's handwriting. Steady, patient, meant for young eyes to follow. November 5th, 2017. First entry. I came here for quiet. I brought Emma because she loves the mountains. Something is wrong with the well water. Emma says it tastes bitter. I think someone upstream is dumping chemicals. Evan flipped forward. The tone changed quickly. Maps showing streams, numbers, dates, test results. Notes about men parking near the ridge, always the same trucks, never the same faces. Nathan Clay hadn't been vacationing. He'd been investigating. Another page. Someone followed us from town. Emma heard footsteps on the porch last night. The pages became frantic. They cut the power. They tampered with the door. I think they poisoned the well. Emma is coughing. I tried to get us out, but the truck won't start. I found fresh boot prints in the shed. Evan felt the edges of the notebook dig into his palm as he turned to the final entry, written in a hand that had lost all steadiness. If you find this, please listen. Emma is alive. Someone locked us in from the outside. I can hear them moving behind the walls. Not mice, not pipes. People. Evan read it twice, then a third time. Each word landing heavier than the last. Locked in, alive, behind the walls. The cabin's silence suddenly felt staged. Ranger stood abruptly. His nails clicked once against the wood. He walked past Evan, straight to the fireplace again. But he didn't stop there. He pivoted left, staring at the wall opposite the hearth. Not the stone floor, not the opening they'd just uncovered. Higher. His head lifted inch by inch until his gaze fixed on a section of wall near the ceiling, where the logs were darker, almost unnaturally clean compared to the rest. Evan's pulse quickened. You're saying it's not below us anymore? Ranger didn't blink. He moved closer, slowly, until his nose touched one of the upper logs. Then he looked back at Evan with an urgency Evan hadn't seen since the war, the kind that meant time wasn't a luxury. Evan climbed onto the table and pressed his ear to the logs. Nothing at first. Just the groan of the storm, the crackle of dying embers. Then a sound, a faint thump. Then another, rhythmic, weak, intelligible. A knock. Evan jerked back as if burned. Ranger's tail stiffened straight behind him, the dog's entire body narrowing to one line of tension. He didn't growl, he didn't move, he listened. Evan pressed his ear again. The knock returned, slightly louder. Not frantic, not random. 3 soft taps, A pause, two more, a pattern. Ranger's eyes flashed. A recognition. "There's someone there," Evan whispered. "Someone alive." The idea was absurd, impossible. 6 years in a cabin wall, no food, no water, no air. But Ranger didn't understand impossible. He understood instinct. And his instinct said the cabin wasn't as empty as it looked. Evan grabbed his flashlight and shined it along the top logs. The wood grain was slightly different. Newer, cleaner. And the nails were on the wrong side, hammered from within. Someone had closed this wall from the outside. Ranger paced once, then sat beneath the spot, pupils locked upward. Evan stepped down, breath sharp. The sheriff, the warnings, the shoe, the sealed chamber, the knock. It all aligned into something too deliberate to ignore. This cabin wasn't abandoned. It was a cage. He turned toward Ranger. "We're not dealing with a ghost story. We're standing in the middle of a crime scene." Ranger held his gaze, steady and resolute, as if to say the words Evan couldn't find. Then the cabin shuddered, a sudden vibration running through the boards like something testing the structure from within. Ranger snapped his head towards the wall again. Evan tightened his grip on the flashlight. The truth wasn't buried under the cabin. It was hiding in its walls, and it had been knocking for 6 years. Morning came in thin grey light, barely strong enough to cut through the frost gathering on the inside of the windows. Evan hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table with the steel case open, pages of the notebooks fanned out like a crime scene he was trying to reassemble. Ranger lay at his feet, but wasn't resting. Every few minutes his ears flicked towards the same section of the wall, the one he had pointed out the night before. Evan needed answers, and he needed them fast. He started searching the cabin room by room, checking every drawer and loose board. Most held nothing but dust or rusted batteries. But in the bedroom, tucked beneath a warped plank of flooring, he found a slim leather folder sealed with brittle tape. Inside were blueprints. Detailed repair drawings of the cabin, stamped and filed 6 years earlier. Every sheet carried an official red stamp from the county office. And at the bottom, in bold ink, was the signature of Sheriff Mason Hargreaves. Evan stared at the page, jaw tightening. Mason had said nothing about this when he came by. No mention of ever setting foot in the cabin. Ranger walked over, sniffed the papers, then the air around the floorboards. He lowered his head, inhaled, and recoiled slightly. His nose wrinkled, a soft rumble in his throat. "What is it?" Evan asked. Ranger sniffed again and backed up. "Chemical. Sharp, clean, manufactured." Evan crouched. He pressed his nose close to the boards. Chlorine. Not the smell of bleach used to tidy an old cabin. Far stronger, the kind used to scrub biological traces. Blood. Sweat. Struggle. Evidence. Someone had cleaned the room. Not years ago. Recently, he followed Ranger's nose along the baseboards. The smell intensified near the wall Ranger had been guarding. Evan pulled a knife from his belt and scraped the wooden edge. A thin residue clung to the blade, clear but sticky. This wasn't housekeeping. It was scene sanitation. He stood slowly, breathing hard. The written warning from Nathan Clay. The shoe. The knocks in the wall. Now this. Ranger exhaled sharply, nose pressed to the logs. His tail was rigid, his stance ready. Someone had been inside this cabin after the Clays disappeared. Someone had cleaned it. Someone who wanted the trail to vanish. Evan grabbed his jacket. He had to go into town. The morning streets of Silver Hollow were still buried in snow. Only one shop was open. The general store owner, an older woman with a lined face and eyes that looked like they had seen too much, watched Evan brush frost off his sleeves as he entered. Ranger shook snow from his coat and stood beside him, silent and alert. "You're the man who bought the Avery Ridge cabin," the woman said. Evan nodded. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "People think that place is haunted. But they've got it wrong. It isn't haunted. It's silenced. Evan straightened. What do you mean? That cabin wasn't abandoned. It was shut up. On purpose. After the Clay girl vanished, the sheriff closed the investigation fast. Too fast. Folk said he sealed the cabin before the search teams even cleared the ridge. Evan felt his stomach tighten. Ranger looked up at the woman, ears swiveling. She glanced at the dog, then leaned closer. If you're smart, you'll walk away from whatever that cabin is hiding. Evan left without buying anything. The cold air slapped him awake as he stepped outside. Ranger gave a soft whine, nudging his leg. A question. A warning. We're not leaving. Evan murmured. They drove back to the ridge. The sky had darkened again. Another storm was coming. As they pulled up, a familiar truck sat parked near the porch. Sheriff Mason stood by the door, one boot on the step, arms folded, face turned toward the woods like he had been waiting. Ranger's growl was instant. Low, controlled, teeth barely visible. The kind that froze men more than a bark would. Mason looked over as Evan stepped out. "Morning," he said, voice too light for the weather. "Thought I'd check in on you? Make sure the cabin didn't collapse on your head overnight." Evan forced a neutral expression. The sheriff's friendliness felt rehearsed. Evan opened the door to the cabin. Mason walked in without being invited, eyes sweeping the room with subtle precision. He paused only when Ranger positioned himself between them, shoulders tense, gaze fixed upward toward the wall. Mason followed the dog's stare. "That where your dog thinks the ghosts are hiding?" Evan didn't answer. Neither did Ranger. Not a blink. Mason walked closer. Too close. His hand brushed the log Ranger had been guarding. "You know, cabins up here shift a lot," he said, voice casual. "Creaks, echoes. Makes a man imagine things in the walls if he's not careful." Ranger stiffened. His nose twitched. His paws spread slightly, ready to lunge if needed. Evan placed a hand through Ranger's fur, grounding him but not restraining him. Evan said, "I found some repairs that were filed by your office. Thought you might know more about what was done here." Mason didn't turn around. His fingers tapped the log once, a gesture too deliberate to be idle. "That was years ago," he said. "Before my time. Paperwork gets messy." But Evan had seen the signature, clear, bold, recent enough to contradict every word coming out of the sheriff's mouth. Ranger moved half a step forward. Mason's eyes cut downward and locked with the dog's. Something cold passed between them. Not fear, recognition. Mason cleared his throat and stepped back. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." He walked out without waiting for a response. Evan shut the door behind him, locking it immediately. Ranger stayed at the wall long after the sheriff's truck disappeared down the trail. Evan knelt beside him and whispered, "What did he smell like to you?" Ranger didn't move, but his silence spoke louder than a bark. He had scented something on Mason, something that matched the chlorine, something that matched the wall. And Evan knew without question. The sheriff hadn't come to check on him. He had come to check on what Evan had uncovered. Ranger pressed his nose against the wall one more time and let out a single breath, sharp and certain. The cabin wasn't done revealing its truth, and neither was the man determined to keep it buried. The second night on Avery Ridge felt heavier than the first. The storm had quieted, but the silence that followed carried its own weight, thick and unnatural. Evan sat at the table reviewing Nathan Clay's notes again, tracing the final lines with his thumb. Ranger lay nearby, head low, eyes fixed on the same stretch of wall he had guarded since morning. Every so often, his ear twitched, as if tuning into a frequency Evan couldn't hear. Then Ranger froze. No warning, no sound. His body locked mid-breath, his head lifted sharply toward the wall above the old dresser. Lips peeled back, teeth bared, breath slicing through the cold air. "What do you hear?" Evan whispered. Ranger didn't look at him. He strode forward in 3 quick steps and slammed his paw against a point on the log wall, nails scraping wood. A guttural sound rose from deep in his chest, not panic, not fear, alert. Evan crossed the room and pressed his ear to the spot. At first there was only his own breathing and the low groan of wind against the roof. Then it came. A faint knock. Just one. Soft, human, from inside the wall. Evan jerked back. Ranger growled again, more urgent this time, pacing in tight circles, nose tapping the same spot over and over. Evan pressed his ear again. Silence. Then another knock. Quicker, desperate. Alive, Evan whispered. His throat tightened. He grabbed a hammer and wedged the claw between 2 logs. Wood splintered under the force. Ranger backed up but remained in position, watching the wall like something behind it might burst through at any second. The first log came free with a crack. The second fell away easier. Evan pushed his entire shoulder into the third until it loosened enough to pull down. Behind it was darkness. And another wall. Not logs. Plaster, smooth, recently sealed. Not 6 years old. New. Someone had built a second barrier. Evan stepped back, breath short. Ranger moved into the gap, sniffing hard at the plaster, tail stiff. He whined once quietly and pressed his forehead to it. Evan could feel the urgency radiating from the dog like heat. All right, we keep going. He grabbed the crowbar. The metal bit into the plaster, cracking it like an eggshell. Dust floated into the air, catching firelight. Ranger sneezed once and took another step back. Evan shoved harder. The plaster gave way, opening a jagged hole just large enough to peer inside. Darkness again. But this time, the air pushing through was warmer, tinged with something human. Stale breath. Old fabric. Evan leaned in, shining his flashlight through the opening. Before the beam landed, something hit the cabin from outside. A hard, sharp bang. A rock, launched with intent. Ranger snapped toward the window, barking once, a deep, thunderous note that made the glass vibrate. Another rock slammed into the siding. Evan dropped the flashlight, grabbed his pistol, and moved toward the door in a low stance. Someone was out, there, watching, waiting for him to be knee-deep in the wall. Ranger planted himself between Evan and the doorway, body rigid, ready to lunge. Then a truck engine rumbled up the trail. Too smooth, too calm. Sheriff Mason's headlights cut through the tree line a moment later. Of course. Mason stepped out into the cold with the casual stride of a man arriving for a friendly visit. But his eyes were wrong. Too alert. Too calculating. Evening, Evan. Saw your lights from the road. Thought I'd check in. Ranger's growl rolled across the porch like a warning siren. Mason paused, eyes flicking to the dog. He offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Easy now. No trouble here. Evan opened the door just wide enough to stand in the frame. What do you want? He kept his voice level, but he didn't hide the tension. Mason stepped onto the porch, hands in his pockets, snow crackling beneath his boots. He looked past Evan into the cabin. His gaze didn't wander. It went straight to the damaged wall behind the dresser. You've been busy. Evan didn't answer. Mason tilted his head, studying the broken logs with a quiet, dangerous curiosity. A word of advice, he said softly. Don't dig too deep. Not every secret in this valley wants daylight. Ranger growled louder, stepping in front of Evan until the sheriff was staring directly into a pair of sharp, amber eyes that refused to blink. Mason's tone thinned. That dog of yours has good instincts. Shame if they got him hurt. Evan clenched his jaw. Get off my property. Mason held the stare a moment longer. Then he nodded once, slow and knowing. Suit yourself. But remember this. Some stories end badly for the people who think they're heroes. He stepped off the porch and walked back to his truck with the same casual stride. The engine rumbled and disappeared into the dark. Evan closed the door and dropped the lock into place. Ranger stayed facing the door long after the sheriff was gone, muscles taut, ears forward. When he finally turned back to the wall, his entire posture changed. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was urgency, protection. A dog putting himself between danger and the truth. Evan knelt beside him and whispered, "What's behind that wall, boy?" Ranger pressed his paw against the plaster again, tapping once, eyes meeting Evan's with a clarity that chilled him. Someone was behind that wall. Someone who had knocked. Someone Mason didn't want found. And the cabin wasn't done revealing its secrets. Not by a long shot. The night collapsed into violence before Evan even reached the table. Ranger's warning came first, sharp and guttural, the kind of bark that vibrated through bone. Then the back door latch snapped. Not opened. Broken. Evan spun toward the sound just as a shadowed figure lunged through the doorway. Ranger launched, a blur of muscle and instinct. He hit the intruder square in the chest, teeth locking onto a padded sleeve. The man screamed and staggered back, crashing into the counter. Ranger dragged him down, snarling with a ferocity Evan had only seen in combat zones. The intruder panicked, swung wildly, then ripped free and crashed through the open door. His boots pounded across the snow. Ranger chased him to the threshold, barking deep into the trees until the footsteps vanished. Evan slammed the door shut and bolted it with the heavy beam. Ranger returned, chest heaving, muzzle flecked with snow and adrenaline. He stood at attention, waiting for direction, but his eyes kept shifting back toward the damaged wall. Evan knelt to check him. No blood, no wounds, just raw determination burning in his stare. "All right, boy," Evan whispered. "Let's finish this." He grabbed the crowbar again and went to the second wall. The plaster had already cracked where he'd hit it earlier. Now he drove the crowbar in with everything he had. Dust exploded outward. Splinters rained to the floor. Ranger stood beside him, barking once every few seconds, as if urging him on, as if whatever lay behind that wall was running out of time. The plaster fell away in sheets. Behind it something metallic gleamed. Not another wall. A door. A small steel hatch, welded shut from the outside. The edges were dark, scorched slightly. Someone had tried to make sure it never opened again. Ranger lost control. He slammed his body against the hatch, paws clawing, nails scraping metal. His bark dropped to a desperate, broken rhythm. Not warning now. Begging. Evan's pulse hammered. "Hold on," he said, voice cracking as he wedged the crowbar under the seam. "Just hold on." The metal groaned. Ranger pressed his shoulder into the door again, shoving alongside Evan, pushing, clawing, howling. The sound wasn't like the growl he used on intruders or explosives or threats. This one had pain in it. And hope. Evan's hand slipped once, twice. The crowbar bent. He slid it higher, dug again with every ounce of strength left in him. The weld cracked. A sharp metallic pop echoed through the cabin. The hatch shifted. A rush of stale air seeped out, warm and humid, wrong compared to the icy cabin. Ranger backed up a step, tail stiff, eyes locked on the seam. Evan dropped the crowbar, gripped the door with both hands, and pulled. The hinges screamed. Then the door came free. He lifted the flashlight and froze. A room no bigger than a closet. Concrete floor, makeshift insulated walls, a small fire pit of stones, 4 blankets, a plastic jug half empty, scratched marks along the floor where someone had paced. And in the far corner, huddled under a thin sheet, knees against her chest, eyes wide and sunken from years in the dark. A girl. Maybe 14 now. Her hair tangled and long, her breathing shallow, her skin pale like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Emma Clay. Alive. Barely. Ranger slid into the opening first, moving low, slow, tail wagging once, gently. He didn't bark. He didn't approach too quickly. He simply lowered his head and inched forward with the softest sound Evan had ever heard from him. A broken whine, concern, recognition. Emma lifted her head. Her lips trembled. "Are you the one with the dog?" she whispered, voice cracking from disuse. "My dad said someone with a dog would come." Evan knelt beside Ranger. "Emma," he said softly. "I'm Evan. We're here to get you out." The girl didn't move at first. She stared at Ranger with a look that broke Evan's chest wide open. A look of belief, of trust finally rewarded. Ranger crawled the last few inches to her, lowering his entire body until he was lying at her feet, ears flat, tail sweeping the floor in slow reassurance. Emma reached out a trembling hand and touched his fur. Her voice cracked into a sob. "He said the dog would find me." Evan swallowed hard. "Your dad was right." He helped her to her feet. She was light, too light, almost weightless in his arms. Ranger walked beside them like a guardian escorting royalty. When they stepped back into the main cabin, the wind picked up outside. Snow battered the windows again, but it sounded different now. Not threatening, cleansing. Evan wrapped a blanket around Emma's shoulders, his hand steady even though his heart felt like it was punching through his ribs. Ranger stayed pressed to her side, every breath syncing with hers, as if reassuring her she wasn't alone anymore. "You're safe now," Evan said. Emma nodded once, then spoke again, barely above a whisper. "The man who locked us in. He comes back at night. He said no one would ever find me." Evan froze. Ranger lifted his head sharply and growled at the door. The storm outside wasn't the only thing returning. Whatever hunted this cabin was still out there, and now they had taken back the one secret that man had held for 6 long years. Emma Clay was alive, and Ranger had found her, just like her father knew he would. The night exploded the moment Evan lifted Emma into his arms. The first headlights appeared at the bottom of the ridge, slicing through the storm like silent knives. Then another pair. Then more. Engines growled beneath the wind, too low, too coordinated to be locals. Ranger stiffened. His head snapped toward the tree line, lips peeling back. A single bark tore from him, sharp and urgent. Evan pulled Emma close. "Stay behind me." But it was already too late for caution. 3 trucks rolled into the clearing, no plates, heavy tires biting into the snow. Doors opened in unison. Men stepped out, each one masked, armed, and moving with practiced intent. At the center of them stood Sheriff Mason. His coat was buttoned wrong, like he'd dressed in a hurry. His breath steamed, but his eyes were ice. "Evening again, Ward," Mason called out, voice carried by the wind. "Seems you've been busy." Emma buried her face against Evan's chest. Ranger growled so low it vibrated through Evan's boots. Evan tightened his hold. "Let us pass, Mason." Mason smiled, the kind that had more hatred than humor. "You weren't supposed to find her. Not you, not anyone. Your damn dog just bought you more trouble than you understand." Evan positioned Emma behind him and stepped forward. Why her? Why lock her inside a wall for 6 years? Mason shrugged like it was nothing more than inconvenience. Her father had documents, test results, maps, proof the mining company's runoff was poisoning the valley. He thought exposing it would save people. His jaw twitched. Instead, it nearly shut down the company that keeps this county alive. Evan felt the truth land like a punch. "You did this," he said softly. "You trapped them both. You let that man die in there." Mason spread his hands. "We tried to persuade him. He refused. He hid the evidence. So we contained the problem." He gestured toward Emma. "The girl was never meant to survive, but she did. Tough kid. Shame you ruined the plan." Evan took a step back, putting himself fully between Mason and Emma. Ranger stood at Evan's heel, muscles trembling from restraint. Mason nodded to his men. "Burn the cabin. Bring the girl." The order snapped the night in half. The nearest man moved forward, raising a canister. He swung it toward the porch, sloshing fuel across the wall. Another flicked a lighter. The flame caught instantly, racing up the logs like the cabin exhaled fire. Emma screamed. Ranger lunged. He hit the arsonist so hard the man spun, crashing backward into the snow. Ranger went for the arm, teeth sinking through the jacket, ripping the lighter away. Gunfire erupted. Evan ducked behind the woodpile, shielding Emma with his body. Splinters burst around them. The fire spread up the outer wall, smoke curling through the window seam. Ranger danced between bullets, dodging like he could see the trajectories. He barreled into a second man, knocking him flat. Snow exploded around them as they rolled. Ranger came up on top and clamped down on the man's wrist until the pistol dropped. Evan grabbed Emma's hand. "Now, move!" They sprinted towards the tree line. Mason shouted something behind them, but the storm swallowed his voice. The burning cabin glowed behind them, the fire reflecting off Ranger's coat as he bounded ahead, clearing the path with savage precision. Every time Evan faltered on the ice, Ranger looped back, touching his leg with his nose, urging him forward. Then a new sound cut through the chaos, a deep rhythmic thump. Rotor blades. Evan looked up. A helicopter descended toward the ridge, searchlight sweeping the trees. He almost laughed from relief. "Lenny." He made the call. The helicopter's beam hit the cabin first, illuminating the blaze. Then it caught the trucks. Then Mason and his men. The loudspeaker roared. "Sheriff Mason, drop your weapon and step away from the child." Mason fired into the air, furious, panicked. "This is my county. You don't order me." But the forest was already filling with movement. State troopers surged through the pines, rifles raised, shouting commands. Snow sprayed under their boots. One tackled a masked man. Another seized the fuel canister. Mason tried to run. Ranger saw it first. He bolted into the dark with a burst of raw instinct. Evan stumbled after him, Emma clinging to his coat. They pushed through brush until they reached the frozen creek bed. There Mason was, slipping across the ice, desperate, muttering curses under his breath. Ranger closed the distance in seconds. He lunged, jaws locking around Mason's coat sleeve, dragging him down. The sheriff screamed and swung wildly, but Ranger held tight, pinning him until troopers rushed in and slammed cuffs on his wrists. Evan reached them, breath white and ragged. Mason glared up, hatred burning through fear. "You think this fixes anything? You think she can prove what happened?" Emma stepped forward, shaking, but steady enough to look him in the eyes. "My dad kept everything. You didn't find it. He made sure someone with a dog would." Mason's face crumpled. Not guilt, defeat. Ranger finally released his grip and backed up, chest heaving, but posture proud. He stood between Emma and Mason, refusing to let the sheriff even look at her. A trooper lifted Mason to his feet. "Read him his rights." The helicopter's light swept over their faces. Snow swirled in bright spirals. The fire behind them roared louder, collapsing the cabin into a storm of sparks. Emma leaned against Evan, exhausted, voice barely audible. "I knew someone would come. I just didn't know the dog would be this brave." Evan looked down at Ranger. He didn't bark. He didn't preen. He simply stood watch, eyes locked on the burning cabin, as though standing guard over the last of the ghosts. "Let's go home," Evan whispered, and with the storm finally breaking around them, they did. Spring came to Silver Hollow like it was apologizing for everything winter had done. Snow melted off the ridge in long silver ribbons. The wind warmed. The pines shook loose their ice and breathed again. And for the first time in 6 years, the Avery Ridge cabin wasn't a place of ghosts. It was a place being rebuilt. Evan stood on the new porch, sleeves rolled up, sawdust on his forearms. A fresh beam rested across 2 sawhorses. Behind him, the cabin walls rose higher every week, each plank and nail turning the place into something different from what it had been. Not a hiding place, not a tomb, a refuge. Down in Denver, Emma Clay was finally home with her aunt. Evan had visited once, bringing Ranger, who stayed at Emma's side the entire time. Emma had hugged the dog so tightly he'd leaned into her, eyes half closed. She looked healthier each visit, softer, human again. He'd told her she could come to the cabin whenever she wanted. She'd whispered she might, someday. But she needed time to learn how to live without walls around her. Evan understood, more than she knew. Now the structure rising behind him had a purpose. It would be a getaway for veterans fighting nightmares, for kids who'd been through hell, for families who needed a place where silence didn't mean danger. A haven shaped by everything he'd endured, and by the dog who had refused to let darkness stay hidden. Ranger padded across the porch, claws tapping lightly on the new boards. His coat had thickened with the season. His ears perked as he scanned the tree line the same way he did every morning. Sentinels didn't retire, they simply found new ground to protect. Evan leaned a hand onto Ranger's back. Still guarding the woods. Ranger didn't look at him, but his tail gave one slow, thoughtful sweep. His gaze stayed fixed on the ridge, on the shade between the pines where enemies had once moved, where Mason had crept like a shadow in his own crimes. Ranger muttered a low breath, not a growl, more like acknowledgement. Not gone. Just watched. Evan understood that too. The cabin had taken nearly 3 months to rebuild. Not because he lacked the skill, but because every piece of wood carried weight. Every nail he drove into the logs felt like stitching up a wound. There were days he'd stop mid-swing, hearing the echo of Emma's knocks through the wall. Days he'd pause when Ranger sniffed a corner of the foundation, remembering where the metal hatch once sealed a child's life away. But each time the memories pushed too close, Ranger nudged him from behind or laid his head on Evan's boot. A reminder. The past didn't own them. They were building something from it. One afternoon, as Evan installed the final porch rail, a truck pulled into the clearing. Lenny stepped out wearing a windbreaker and a grin. "You turned this place into a postcard, man." Evan wiped his hands on his jeans. "Hard work and stubbornness?" Lenny nodded toward Ranger. And him. Ranger trotted down the steps to greet him. Lenny knelt, rubbing the dog behind the ears. "Your dog's famous, you know. Half the state thinks he's some kind of legend." "He is," Evan said simply. Lenny stood, serious now. "They're starting the environmental trials next month. Mason flipped on everyone. The mining company's got a whole swarm of lawyers, but the evidence you and Ranger uncovered, they can't bury that." Evan's jaw tightened. "Good." Lenny clapped him on the shoulder. "You did right. And Emma, she's safe because of you two." Evan didn't answer. He didn't need to. A gust of wind pushed through the clearing. Ranger lifted his head, watching it move. The dog's posture softened. He sat down on the porch, chest high, face toward the forest. Evan followed his gaze. The old burn marks from the fire still scarred patches of earth, but small shoots of green pushed through them. The land was healing itself, slowly but honestly, just like everyone touched by this story. Evan grabbed 2 mugs and poured coffee. He handed one to Lenny. "You think she'll ever come back here?" Evan asked. "Emma?" "Yeah." Lenny sipped the coffee, thinking. Maybe. Kids like her. Sometimes they need to know the place that hurt them can become something different before they face it. Evan nodded, staring at the half-finished cabin. "That's what I'm trying to build." Ranger walked back to the porch's edge, lay down, and rested his head on his paws. But his eyes stayed alert. watching, guarding, listening for threats that might never come again, but that he would be ready for if they did. Evan sat beside him, letting his hand settle into the dog's fur. "You can rest now," he said quietly. Ranger blinked once, but he didn't rest. He simply shifted his weight, leaning against Evan's leg like a quiet reminder that healing didn't mean lowering your guard. It meant facing the world with someone beside you who refused to break. A moment later, a breeze rustled through the valley. Warm, gentle, different. Evan felt the corners of his mouth lift. Not peace, but something close. And for the first time since arriving at the $500 haunted cabin, he didn't feel like a man living inside someone else's tragedy. He felt like he was writing something new, something that might last. The truth didn't crawl out of Silver Hollow quietly. It ripped its way across Colorado like a storm with purpose. Within 48 hours, the discovery in the Avery Ridge cabin triggered a statewide investigation. The sealed room, the journals, the environmental samples, Emma Clay alive after 6 years of being hidden in the dark. Everything Evan had feared was now impossible to bury. Reporters swarmed Denver. State investigators descended on Silver Hollow. By the end of the week, the Attorney General held a press conference with a backdrop of evidence crates stacked higher than the podium. The headlines came fast. Sheriff Mason Hargreaves arrested. Local officials charged in conspiracy cover-up. Mining corporation under criminal review. Missing teacher's name finally cleared. Nathan Clay's photograph, once the face of a cold case, now stood at the center of a justice that had taken too long to arrive. What began as whispers in a forgotten mountain town had become a reckoning the entire state could feel. Emma Clay, 14 now, sat in a safe interview room while 2 trauma specialists worked gently through the timeline of her captivity. She was small for her age, quiet, steady-eyed in a way that made adults pause. She spoke clearly, without hesitation. She told them how her father had built stories to keep her brave, how he taught her to tap back when she heard him tapping, how he'd tucked his last note into the steel box under the hearth when he realized someone was sealing the door from outside, and how he promised that someone with a dog, one brave enough, smart enough, would someday find her. When the recording finished, one of the investigators wiped his eyes before the camera cut. It aired on every major network. The world learned the truth from the girl who had survived it. Meanwhile, Ranger became something else, something larger than the story that found him. The VI contacted Evan with a proposal. They wanted Ranger to become the founding dog of a new therapy program for children who had survived abduction, prolonged isolation, or violent trauma. A program that paired retired canines with kids learning to trust the world again. Evan wasn't sure at first. Ranger was older now. His muzzle had taken on silver streaks. He slept deeper, moved slower on cold mornings. But something in him still sparked when he saw Emma. Something that said he understood children who had been forced to grow up in the dark. The first time they introduced Ranger to the group, a boy who hadn't spoken aloud since being found 2 months earlier reached out and pressed his palm to Ranger's chest. Just a touch, but it was enough. The boy whispered high. A single word shattered an entire wall the world had built around him. Ranger stood so still it felt reverent, then gently lowered his head into the boy's lap. Evan watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a familiar ache tightening his throat. That dog, he thought. He always knew who needed him most. And Ranger changed too. Slowly, softly. His coat grew thicker. His gait became more relaxed. He put on a few pounds from all the treats kids slipped him when they thought the adults weren't looking. His eyes stayed sharp, sharp like the night he stood in the Avery cabin and refused to step back from danger. But warmer now, like the weight he carried was finally being shared. He was no longer the dog searching ruined roads in Afghanistan. No longer the sentinel pacing the walls of a haunted cabin. He was something simpler, purer. He was hope with 4 paws. As the investigation deepened, one more twist emerged. The mining corporation that had hired Mason wasn't just covering up environmental damage. They'd been running off-the-book security operations in isolated mountain communities. Nathan Clay had discovered it by accident while researching faulty water tables. His death wasn't misfortune. It was strategy. Hargreaves flipped first. He named deputies. He named corporate liaisons. He named state officials willing to look the other way for money or power. One by one, they fell. And every time a new arrest broke on the news, Emma flinched but didn't look away. She wanted the world to see what her father died trying to expose. Evan visited her again after her interview with prosecutors. She sat outside on the balcony of her aunt's apartment building, Ranger's head resting in her lap. The dog looked like a statue guarding her, but his tail swung lazily whenever she whispered to him. "Did I do the right thing?" she asked, "telling them everything?" Evan crouched beside her. "You did more than right. You did brave." Emma nodded, but only after glancing at Ranger, like she trusted the dog's approval more than any adult's. His eyes stayed steady on hers, warm and sure. That night, when Evan and Ranger drove back into the mountains, the air felt different. Lighter. Not healed, but beginning. Ranger stuck his head halfway out the window, even though it was cold, letting the wind wash over him. Evan laughed softly. "You did this, buddy, whether you know it or not." Ranger settled back into the seat, pressed his body against Evan's arm, and gave one slow blink. The kind that said he knew. Justice had begun its slow, grinding work. Families had answers. Emma had a future. And Ranger, older, heavier, wiser, wasn't a ghost hunter in a haunted cabin anymore. He was a legacy living in real time. The kind of legacy built from instinct and loyalty and a stubborn refusal to look away when the world hid its worst. The storm had passed, but the truth he'd uncovered would outlive every one of them. The sky over Avery Ridge was a soft gold when the news crew arrived. Late afternoon light spilled across the rebuilt cabin, catching the edges of new cedar boards and the metal roof that hummed quietly in the breeze. The forest behind it stood calm, unthreatening for once, like even the pines knew the war here was over. Ranger lay on the porch beside Evan's boots, his muzzle touched with white now, his breathing slow and steady. But his eyes, those sharp, amber eyes, missed nothing. They never had. The reporter, a woman in her 30s with a steady voice and a notebook she kept forgetting to write in, walked up the steps with a cautious smile. "Thank you for doing this, Evan. I know you don't usually talk to cameras." Evan shrugged. "I'm not doing it for cameras." She nodded toward Ranger. "For him, then? For him? And for her?" he said quietly. "For Emma." The reporter glanced at the dog, who watched her with the same unwavering focus he used in the cabin, in the snowstorm, and in every moment since. She hesitated, then asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "What do you think made Ranger the first to find Emma Clay?" Evan took a long breath. He looked down at the dog who had once dragged him out of a life he thought was finished and into a truth that changed an entire state. Ranger lifted his head, ears angled, as if listening for something only he could hear. Evan answered softly. He didn't bark for danger. He barked for the truth. The reporter lowered her notebook. The crew behind her froze. The breeze quieted, and Ranger, almost on cue, gave one sharp, deliberate bark. Not warning, not fear, a punctuation mark, a full stop on a story 6 years buried. Evan smiled beneath his breath. There it is. The reporter swallowed hard, suddenly blinking faster than the sunlight required. People say he saved her life." She whispered. "He saved more than that," Evan said. "He saved what was left of mine. He saved this valley. He saved a truth no one wanted to carry. He's something else." Ranger rested his chin on Evan's knee, content, as if finally allowing himself a moment of rest. But the world didn't let the story rest. In the months after Emma's rescue, letters arrived at the cabin in bundles. Parents, teachers, veterans who had been through their own storms, survivors who understood what it meant to trust a sound in the dark. Some wrote that Ranger made them believe in instinct again. Some wrote that Emma's courage made them believe in healing. And some wrote just one line: "Thank you for letting the truth live." Evan read every letter. Ranger seemed to sense each one, nosing the envelopes as if checking them for sincerity. The reporter finished her interview near sunset. She shook Evan's hand, then crouched to lay a palm gently on Ranger's head. "Thank you," she whispered, "for all of it." Ranger closed his eyes, accepting the gratitude without needing to understand the words. When the crew left, Evan and Ranger stayed on the porch, watching their tail lights disappear down the mountain road. The valley fell quiet again, not the tense quiet of danger, the earned quiet of peace. Evan leaned forward. "You know, buddy, they'll tell this story for a long time." Ranger didn't move. His ears twitched once, listening. Evan's voice dropped to something only the dog and the trees could hear. "And every version will start the same way. With you. With the moment you refused to back away from that hearth." Ranger inhaled deeply, exhaled through his nose, then stood and walked to the edge of the porch. He stared into the tree line where so much of their fear once lived. Now it was just forest again. Just wind, just life. But Ranger stayed watching anyway. Old habits, old promises. Evan joined him, hands in his pockets. "Think she'll come visit once summer's here?" he asked. Ranger's tail flicked once, an answer without a word. Evan nodded. "Me too." The light dimmed. A chill swept across the ridge. Somewhere far below, a creek murmured against the rocks like a voice telling the mountain to rest. Evan glanced down at Ranger. "You didn't just find a girl," he said. "You found the proof. You found the man who hurt her. You found the truth about this valley. You found the people who needed you most. That's your legacy." Ranger stepped closer, leaning lightly into Evan's leg. Then he looked up, eyes reflecting the last streak of daylight on the horizon. And Evan felt that same thing he felt the night Ranger scraped his paw against the hearthstone. The same certainty, the same warning, the same faith. A dog's instinct wasn't magic, it was heart. Evan turned toward the camera that wasn't there anymore, toward whatever future audience would hear this story one day. He spoke to them as if speaking into the wind. "Everyone's got a story with a loyal pet. Maybe it saved you. Maybe it changed you. Maybe it showed you a truth you weren't ready to see." He looked down at Ranger. "Sometimes a dog doesn't bark for danger." His voice softened. "He barks for the truth." Ranger barked once more into the quiet woods, firm and sure. And the story closed on that sound. A call to memory, a call to courage, a call to every person who ever looked into a dog's eyes and saw something bigger than themselves. What's your story with a loyal pet? If you believe in instinct, if you believe in healing, if you believe that 4 paws can change a life, share your story, honor your companion, and join us at German Shepherd, where loyalty lives forever.